Tonight, we're going to follow a woman through her day in 14th century England, and we're going to discover that nearly everything you might assume about medieval women is both true and incomplete. Yes, her life is constrained by expectations and limited by law and shaped by the reality that she lives in a world designed primarily by and for men. But within those constraints, she builds something remarkable. She manages an entire household economy, raises children who might actually survive to adulthood, maintains relationships that keep her family fed and sheltered, and somehow finds moments of joy in a life that offers very few guarantees of anything except hard work. This is not a story about oppression, though that exists, nor is it a story about some imagined medieval feminism, because that would be anachronistic nonsense. This is simply a story about competence, endurance, and the particular kind of strength required to keep a household running when everything from childbirth to a bad harvest could end your world without warning. So settle in and meet a woman whose name history never recorded, but whose labor made history possible. Before we step into her world, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy these journeys into history's quiet corners, consider subscribing to join us regularly. We'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something remarkable about knowing our community spans different places and time zones, all gathering here to explore the ordinary lives that made history possible. So time for me to hand things over to Corey. He's going to walk you through everything that comes next. Corey, whenever you're ready.
Let's begin. She wakes before dawn, as she always does, because the work of a household does not wait for sunrise or personal preference or the luxury of feeling rested. The darkness is complete, the kind of black that only exists before humans invented too many lights. Next to her, her husband breathes in the heavy rhythm of someone still deep in sleep. She lets him rest a few minutes longer because his day will be long and physically demanding, and because she is kind even when kindness is inconvenient. She rises carefully, feeling for the edge of the sleeping platform with her feet, avoiding the spot where the straw beneath the mattress has compressed into a lump that catches you wrong if you step on it. The air is cold enough that her breath forms small clouds. October has arrived with its usual lack of concern for human comfort, and the fire from last night has died down to coals that glow faintly in the hearth. She wraps her outer tunic around herself, the wool ruff against her linen shift, and pads across the packed earth floor toward the fire. Rebuilding the fire from coals is a skill she learned so young she cannot remember learning it. You uncover the coals carefully, add small kindling, blow gently, but not too gently. Add slightly larger sticks, wait for the flames to establish themselves, then add logs. Rush it, and you smother everything. Go too slowly, and the coals die before the wood catches. She has done this, perhaps 10,000 times in her life, and her hands move through the process with the automatic precision of deep practice. The flames take hold and begin their work of pushing back the darkness. Light fills the single room that serves as her family's entire domestic world. In the corner, her 3 children sleep in a tumbled pile of limbs and blankets. The oldest is 8, a daughter who's already learning the endless list of tasks that will define her own adult life. The middle child is 5, a son whose energy during waking hours seems impossible to contain, but who sleeps now with the complete surrender of the young. The baby is 18 months, curled against her sister, thumb in mouth, face peaceful in that way that babies manage even when their noses are running and their gums are swollen from incoming teeth. She allows herself a moment to simply look at them. These 3 small people who depend entirely on her continued competence and survival. The wave of love that washes over her is so familiar it barely registers as an emotion anymore. It is simply part of her baseline state of being, like breathing or having a heartbeat. She loves them with a fierceness that would terrify her if she stopped to examine it. So she does not stop to examine it. She simply continues with the morning's tasks. Water must be fetched from the well, a job she would normally send her daughter to do. But the child is still asleep, and the morning is dark and cold. So she takes the wooden bucket herself. Outside, the village is silent except for a rooster who has miscalculated dawn and is announcing it approximately an hour too early. Other roosters, more competent at their jobs, remain silent. She walks the familiar path to the well, passing houses identical to her own. Home to families she has known her entire life. The well is communal, serving perhaps 20 households, and someone has left a bucket on the ground instead of hanging it properly. She tuts softly, a sound of mild disapproval that she learned from her own mother and will presumably pass on to her daughter, creating an unbroken chain of tutting that stretches back generations. She hangs the abandoned bucket correctly, then lowers her own, listening for the splash that means it has hit water, then hauling it back up with the arm strength that comes from doing this twice a day for 20 years. The water sloshes as she walks back, cold enough that condensation forms on the outside of the bucket. A few drops escape and hit her foot, and she makes a mental note to check the bucket for cracks later, adding this to the running list of tasks that exist perpetually in her mind. The list is never complete. Finishing one task simply makes room for another. This would be depressing if she thought about it too much, so she has learned not to think about it too much. Back inside, she pours some water into the iron pot that hangs over the fire. Pottage for breakfast, the same breakfast they eat most mornings, made from whatever grain they have and whatever vegetables are available, and occasionally a bit of meat if they are fortunate. Today will be a meatless pottage, thick with barley and onions and the last of the autumn carrots. She begins the preparation with movements so practiced they require almost no thought. Her daughter wakes first, as she usually does, sitting up and rubbing her eyes with small fists. She is at that age where she resembles both a child and a woman she will become. Her face still round with youth, but her expressions already showing the personality that will define her adult self. She is cautious and observant, and occasionally stubborn in ways that remind her mother of herself, which is both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "Good morning, little bird," she says softly, and her daughter smiles, still half asleep, but pleased at the pet name. The child rises and comes to the fire without being asked, ready to help, already understanding that a household functions because everyone contributes what they can. At 8 years old, she can fetch water, mind the baby, help with food preparation, feed the chickens, and perform a dozen other small tasks that collectively make an enormous difference. Together, they work in the comfortable silence of people who understand each other's rhythms. Her daughter chops onions with a knife that is kept sharp because dull knives are dangerous, and she has taught the child to respect the blade while using it confidently. The onions go into the pot, followed by barley that has been soaking overnight, followed by water and a pinch of salt that they use sparingly because salt is expensive. Okay? And they are not. Her husband wakes as the sky begins to lighten, stretching and groaning in the way of men who are about to spend another day doing heavy labor. He is a good man, steady and reliable, prone to occasional bad jokes and a tendency to leave his tools wherever he last used them, but faithful and hardworking and kind to his children. She married him at 15, which seemed impossibly young at the time, but which is simply normal in their world. They have been married for 11 years now, and she knows his moods and habits as well as she knows her own. He kisses her forehead absently, a gesture of affection that has become ritual rather than romance, but which still matters. He nods to their daughter, who pings at him with the uncomplicated adoration that daughters often have for fathers who are present and decent. The boys wake in sequence, the 5-year-old bouncing up with immediate energy, the baby crying briefly before being soothed by his sister, who picks him up with the practiced competence of someone who has been doing this since she was barely bigger than the baby herself. Breakfast is served in wooden bowls that have been in use for years, their surfaces worn smooth by countless scrubbings. The pottage is hot and filling and tastes primarily of barley and onions, which is exactly what it is. No one complains because complaining about food implies there are alternatives, and there are no alternatives. You eat what is available, and you are grateful it exists. Her husband finishes quickly and heads out to the fields where he will spend the day, doing whatever the season requires. Today, it is probably clearing drainage ditches, work that is both necessary and deeply unpleasant, involving cold water and mud, and the strong possibility of disturbing rats. She is glad it is his job and not hers, though her own day will be no easier, simply different, once he is gone. She surveys her domestic kingdom and begins the mental calculation of what must be done today versus what can wait until tomorrow. The baby needs clean cloths, which means washing, which requires heating, water, and finding time while also watching 3 children and preparing the midday meal and working on the wool that sits in the corner, waiting to be spun, and 2, checking whether the bread dough from yesterday has risen enough to bake. She decides to tackle the washing first. While the morning is still relatively young, her daughter helps carry more water from the well, both of them making multiple trips until the large washing tub is full enough. They heat some of the water over the fire until it is warm but not hot, because hot water requires more fuel than they can justify for laundry. She adds soap, a precious substance made from animal fat, and lye, used sparingly because making it is a long, unpleasant process she would rather not repeat more often than necessary. The baby's soiled cloths go into the water, along with her husband's spare tunic and the children's shifts that have accumulated the various stains of childhood. She scrubs each item with the dedication of someone who knows that cleanliness is connected to health, even if she does not know exactly why. She only knows that families who wash regularly seem to stay healthier than those who do not, and that is evidence enough for her. Her daughter helps with the wringing, her small hands not quite strong enough to extract all the water, but contributing what she can. The child's face shows concentration and pride in equal measure, pleased to be useful, aware that she is learning skills that will serve her throughout her life. They hang the washing on a line strung between 2 posts outside, where it will dry slowly in the cool autumn air, or possibly not dry at all if the weather turns, in which case everything will smell of damp wool and mild regret. While the washing flaps in the breeze, she turns her attention to the chickens, who have been making increasingly demanding noises from their coop. The chickens are her responsibility, part of the household economy that she manages directly. They produce eggs that feed the family and can be traded for other goods. They occasionally become dinner themselves when they stop laying or when meat is needed for a special occasion. She has named them all, which her husband finds amusing and slightly ridiculous, but she ignores his gentle teasing because naming things makes them easier to care for. She opens the small door, K, and they emerge in a flurry of feathers and opinions, heading immediately for the scattered grain she throws for them. The red hen is bossy and productive, the undisputed leader of the small flock. The brown hen is nervous and prone to hiding her eggs in strange places, requiring daily searches that sometimes feel like treasure hunts. The black hen is old and possibly wise, or possibly just tired, contributing fewer eggs but maintaining her position in the flock through sheer force of personality and strategic pecking. She checks the nesting boxes and finds 4 eggs, which is acceptable, if not remarkable. 1 will be saved for tomorrow's baking because eggs make bread rise better and taste richer. The others will supplement today's meals, adding protein that growing children need and that adults appreciate. She carries the eggs carefully back inside, placing them in a bowl with the tenderness of someone who knows their value, both nutritionally and economically. The morning progresses through its established rhythm. The baby needs feeding, which she does while simultaneously watching the fire and instructing her daughter on the correct way to prepare flax for spinning. The 5-year-old plays with small wooden toys his father carved during the long winter evenings, creating elaborate scenarios that involve what appears to be a battle between a horse and a cow, which makes perfect sense to him and no sense to anyone else. She watches him with affection, knowing that his imagination will eventually be channeled to more practical directions, but seeing no harm in letting it flourish for now. Around mid-morning, a neighbor appears at the door, a woman roughly her own age who lives 3 houses down and with whom she has maintained a friendship since childhood. The neighbor carries a basket containing bread and cheese, evidence that she is heading somewhere. It's probably to visit her mother who lives in the next village and has been unwell. They exchange news quickly, speaking in the efficient shorthand of people who know each other's lives intimately and can communicate volumes with a few words and significant looks. The neighbor's oldest son is showing signs of the same fever that took her youngest daughter last spring, a loss that still shows in the shadows under her eyes and the careful way she speaks about her remaining children. The midwife has been consulted and has recommended willow bark tea and prayers to St. Blaise, covering both practical medicine and spiritual intervention. Her own mother is recovering slowly from her illness, but remains weak and forgetful, which worries the neighbor because winter's coming and weakness in winter is dangerous. She listens with the attention of someone who understands that her neighbor's troubles could easily become her own troubles. Illness spreads through villages like water through cloth, moving from house to house with terrifying efficiency, and everyone's health is connected to everyone else's health. She offers sympathy in a small jar of honey, which has healing properties according to tradition, and which she can spare because they had a good year for the bees. Her neighbor accepts with gratitude and promises to return the favor when she can, and this is how their world works. An endless exchange of small kindnesses and mutual support that keeps everyone slightly safer than they would be alone. After the neighbor leaves, she returns to her work with renewed focus and a small flutter of anxiety about illness that she pushes down because worrying accomplishes nothing. The wool in the corner has been waiting patiently for her attention, and she settles onto her stool with a spindle and begins the meditative process of turning raw fleece into thread. This is work that medieval women do constantly, so constantly that it becomes synonymous with women's work itself. The word spinster will eventually mean unmarried woman, but right now it simply means someone who spins, and everyone who can manage a spindle does so during any spare moment. Her daughter sits nearby with her own small spindle, learning the skill that will serve her throughout her life. The child's thread is uneven and occasionally breaks, but this is expected. Skill comes from practice, and practice requires patience from both teacher and student. They work in companionable silence, the spindles turning, the thread growing longer, the morning sunlight slanting through the open door and creating patterns on the packed earth floor. Spinning is work that requires attention, but not intense concentration, which makes it perfect for thinking. She thinks about many things as the spindle turns. She thinks about whether they have enough grain to last until next harvest, running calculations in her head about consumption rates and family size, and the possibility of needing to buy additional supplies if the winter is long. She thinks about her middle son's cough and whether it is simply autumn cold or something more concerning that requires the attention of the village healer. She thinks about the roof that needs repairing before winter arrives in earnest, and whether they can afford to pay someone with proper skills or whether her husband will attempt it himself and possibly fall, which seems exactly like the kind of thing he would do. She thinks about her own mother, who died in childbirth when she was 12, leaving her to manage a household years before she was ready. Thrust into adulthood with terrifying suddenness, she thinks about how much of what she knows came from watching her mother work, absorbing knowledge through observation and repetition, learning by doing alongside someone who had patience and skill to share. She thinks about how her daughter is doing the same thing now, learning by watching, and how this chain of knowledge passes from woman to woman across generations, an unbroken line of accumulated wisdom about how to keep a household functioning. The thread grows on the spindle, wrapping around it in layers that will eventually be woven into cloth. Her daughter's smallest spindle turns more slowly but steadily, the child's face showing the serious concentration of someone learning something important. The baby has discovered a patch of sunlight on the floor and sits in it contentedly, examining his own toes with the fascinated attention that very young children bring to discovering their own bodies. The 5-year-old has abandoned his toys and is now attempting to teach the cat to fetch, a project that is doomed to failure, but which he pursues with optimistic determination. The cat tolerates this with the patient resignation of an animal that has learned to ignore most human nonsense. She watches her son with affection, remembering when his older sister went through a similar phase of believing that animals could be trained to behave like different animals if you just explain things clearly enough. Midday approaches, announced by the position of the sun and the growing demands of her own stomach. She sets aside the spinning to prepare dinner, the main meal of the day that her husband will return home for, assuming his work allows him to break at the appropriate time. Today, it will be bread and cheese and the last of yesterday's pottage, reheated and possibly improved by a day of sitting, or possibly not improved at all, but at least still edible. She slices the bread with the care of someone who knows exactly how much bread exists and how long it must last before the next baking day. The loaves are dense and dark, made from a mixture of wheat and rye, because pure wheat bread is expensive and they are not wealthy. The bread is substantial and filling, which is what matters. It provides the bulk of their daily calories, the foundation upon which the rest of their diet is built. The cheese is hard and slightly salty, made from their cow's milk and aged in a small, cool space beneath the house. It is not fancy cheese by any measure, but it is protein and fat and flavor, all of which are valuable. She cuts it into portions that are carefully calibrated to family hierarchy, largest for her husband, who does the heaviest physical labor, second largest for herself, who is nursing the baby, smaller portions for the older children, smallest for the baby, who mostly throws food anyway. Her husband returns, dusty and tired, smelling of mud and effort and a particular scent that comes from a morning spent in drainage ditches. He washes his hands and face in the bucket she has set out for this purpose, using the small piece of rough cloth designated for this use, then sits at the table while she serves the food. The children cluster around, the daughter helping serve with growing competence, the middle son already reaching for bread before grace is said, the baby banging his wooden spoon against the table with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered percussion and believes it to be humanity's greatest achievement. They eat together, the conversation minimal because everyone is hungry and tired. Her husband mentions that he saw deer tracks near the northern field, which is interesting but not particularly useful since hunting deer is illegal for people of their station, and being caught poaching can result in fines. They absolutely cannot afford or worse punishments that do not bear thinking about. The daughter reports that the brown hen has been acting strange, possibly preparing to go broody, which would be inconvenient timing but cannot be prevented because chickens follow their own schedules and care nothing for human convenience. The middle son announces that he can count to 20 now, demonstrating this skill with pride and only minor errors. She praises him warmly because confidence is worth encouraging even when accuracy is still developing. Her husband confirms the counting with grave seriousness, treating their son's achievement with the respect it deserves, and the boy glows with pleasure. After the meal, her husband returns to the fields, taking the middle son with him because the boy is old enough now to begin learning what his father does, even if his primary contribution will be getting in the way and asking questions about everything. She watches them go, her husband's broad back and her son's small form walking together down the path, and feels the familiar mixture of pride and worry that comes with watching children grow toward independence. She is left with her daughter and the baby, which is actually easier than having all 3 children underfoot, though she would never say this aloud because it seems wrong to have favorites even when you obviously do. The daughter is helpful and increasingly competent. The baby is mobile but still manageable. The 5-year-old is a force of chaos who requires constant supervision to prevent him from doing something creative and dangerous. With him gone for the afternoon, she can actually accomplish tasks without interruption every 7 minutes. The bread dough from yesterday has risen adequately, she discovers upon checking, which means today is baking day, whether she feels ready for it or not. Baking is a significant undertaking, requiring careful management of the fire and precise timing and constant attention to prevent burning. She has been baking bread since she was younger than her daughter is now, and still every loaf represents a small victory over the many things that can go wrong. She shapes the dough into loaves with practiced hands, forming them into the rounded shapes that will bake evenly in the clay oven outside. Her daughter watches closely, learning through observation the exact tension the dough should have, the way it should feel under your hands, the subtle signs that tell you whether it needs more kneading or is ready to bake. This knowledge cannot be written down or explained in words. It must be learned through touch and repetition, passed from woman to woman through demonstration and practice. While the loaves rest for their final rise, she turns her attention to mending. Her husband's spare hose have developed a hole that will become a larger hole if not addressed now. The fabric is worn thin in several places, evidence of hard use and the general reality that clothing in the 14th century must work much harder than any single garment should reasonably be expected to work. She settles near the window where the light is better and begins the careful process of weaving her needle through the fabric, closing the hole with small, neat stitches. Her daughter takes the baby outside to play, giving her some rare quiet in which to work. She can hear them through the open door, the baby's delighted squeals as his sister makes faces at him, the gentle murmur of her daughter's voice as she narrates some story involving the chickens and an imaginary adventure. The sound makes her smile even as she focuses on her stitching, grateful for a daughter who is both helpful and naturally affectionate with her younger siblings. The needle moves in and out of the wool, closing the hole with stitches that are nearly invisible if you do not look closely. She learned to sew from her mother, who learned from her mother, the same techniques passing down through generations of women who all understood that keeping clothes intact was not optional in a world where new clothes were expensive and rare. A well-mended garment could last for years. A poorly mended one would fail quickly and require replacement they could not afford as she works. Her mind returns to the calculations that occupy much of her mental energy. Food stores for winter, fuel for the fire, the health of each family member and the signs that might indicate developing problems, the social obligations they owe to neighbors and the favors owed to them, the upcoming holy days and what food traditions they will need to honor, the state of their tools and household goods and what might need replacing soon. These calculations are constant and complex, involving variables that change daily. A good harvest means different decisions than a poor harvest. A sick child requires resources that a healthy child does not. A favor owed creates obligations that must be remembered and honored. She keeps all of this in her head, a mental ledger of debts and credits and necessities and possibilities, constantly updated and revised based on new information. A traveling peddler comes through the village, his call announcing his presence before she can see him. She sets aside her mending and goes to the door with interest, because peddlers bring news and goods and occasional gossip that makes the day more interesting. He displays his wares with practiced enthusiasm, spreading them on a cloth laid on the ground. Needles, thread, small pieces of ribbon, a few poorly made trinkets that sparkle appealingly in the sunlight, some herbs and spices that he claims are fresh from London, though this seems unlikely given their appearance. She examines a packet of needles, because hers are wearing down and will need replacing eventually. Good needles are valuable, the difference between mending that holds and mending that fails. She tests one carefully, checking that it is properly hardened and not too brittle, that the eye is smooth and will not shred thread, that the point is sharp enough to pierce fabric cleanly. The peddler watches her assessment with the resignation of someone who knows. He is dealing with an experienced buyer who cannot be fooled by inferior goods. They negotiate with a careful dance of people who both know the approximate value of things and are both trying to get a slightly better deal. She offers eggs because eggs are currency in a village economy where actual coins are rare. He counters by suggesting the needles are exceptionally fine and worth more than eggs. She observes mildly that the needles look ordinary and that her eggs are fresh and from well-fed hens, which makes them more valuable than ordinary eggs. He mentions that needles must travel a great distance to reach this village, implying transportation costs justify higher prices. She notes that eggs do not travel at all. They are produced locally, which makes them more reliable than goods that might or might not arrive. He sighs dramatically, suggesting that he is barely making any profit on this transaction. She maintains a pleasant but unmoved expression, communicating that his profit margins are not her concern. Eventually, they reach an agreement that satisfies neither of them completely, which means it is probably fair. 3 eggs for the packet of needles, with an additional egg thrown in if he will share whatever news he has from other villages. He accepts this amendment with alacrity, because news is free to share, and peddlers understand that information builds goodwill that leads to future sales. While she wraps the eggs carefully in cloth for him to carry, the peddler shares his accumulated gossip. There has been a dispute over grazing rights in the next town over, resolved by the manor court with fines levied against both parties, which satisfies no one but at least provides the lord with additional revenue. Someone's barn burned down under circumstances that are unclear but probably involve a combination of old thatch, dry weather, and human carelessness rather than anything supernatural, despite rumors to the contrary. Traveling friar has been preaching near the market cross in the larger village 2 days' walk from here, warning about sin and encouraging donations to the church and promising that the end times are near, which friars have been saying for centuries and will presumably continue saying for centuries more. A merchant's wife in the town has been seen wearing a new headdress that is apparently very elaborate and possibly inappropriate for someone of her station, though the peddler's description of inappropriate involves so much detail about fabric and construction that she suspects he has a professional interest in textiles. She listens with the attention of someone who understands that information is valuable. Knowing what is happening in neighboring villages helps her understand trends and patterns, prepares her for what might be coming their way, gives her conversational material to share with her own neighbors later. When the peddler moves on, his pack lighter by 1 packet of needles, heavier by 4 eggs, and presumably feeling that he got a reasonable deal, she returns to her mending with her mind full of new information to process and file away. The afternoon light begins its slow decline toward evening. She retrieves the bread from where it has been rising and carries the loaves carefully to the outdoor oven. The oven is communal, shared by several households, built of clay and stone and maintained through collective effort. Someone has already been baking today, which means the oven is warm and will not require as much fuel to reach proper temperature. She adds wood to the fire inside, waiting for the interior to heat sufficiently. Testing the oven temperature is an art earned through experience and occasional burned fingers. She holds her hand inside briefly, counting in her head, judging the heat by how quickly it becomes uncomfortable. The oven is almost ready. She adds a bit more wood, waits a few more minutes, tests again. This time the heat is correct, the kind of fierce warmth that will bake bread evenly without burning it. She slides the loaves onto the oven floor, using a long wooden peel, working quickly because the heat is intense and precision matters. The loaves settle into place, arranged so air can circulate around them. She closes the oven opening partially, leaving enough gap for steam to escape while maintaining the heat inside. Now comes the waiting, the careful monitoring. It's the judgment about when to check them and when to leave them alone while the bread bakes. She tends to other tasks that can be done nearby. The vegetable garden needs attention, even this late in the season. The last of the carrots should be pulled and stored. The herbs need harvesting before frost kills them. She works steadily, pulling carrots and shaking dirt from their roots, bundling herbs and hanging them to dry. Her daughter helps, learning which plants are which, how to harvest without damaging what remains, where things are stored and why. The baby sits in a patch of sunlight, playing with dirt and small stones with the intense concentration that small children bring to even the simplest activities. She keeps him in her peripheral vision, ready to intervene if he decides to eat something inappropriate. But for now, he is content with his simple entertainment. This is one of the small mercies of caring for children. These brief periods when they occupy themselves peacefully and require no immediate intervention. The smell of baking bread begins to fill the air. That particular scent that means comfort and sustenance and the successful completion of difficult work. She checks the loaves carefully, judging their progress by color and sound, tapping the bottoms to hear if they sound hollow. They need more time. She returns to her harvesting, keeping track of minutes in her head with the accuracy of someone who's learned to measure time by internal sense rather than any external clock. When the bread is ready, she removes it with the same careful precision she used to insert it, sliding the peel under each loaf and extracting them from the heat. The loaves are golden brown and properly baked, neither pale and underdone nor dark and scorched. She allows herself a moment of satisfaction at this small victory. Each successful baking represents skill and attention and the prevention of waste in a world where wasting food is not acceptable. The loaves cool on a wooden rack while she banks the oven fire and tidies the area. The bread will feed her family for the next few days, providing the foundation of their meals, the reliable substance that fills stomachs and provides energy for work. She has baked thousands of loaves in her life and will bake thousands more. And each one matters because each one represents survival continuing for another few days. Her husband returns as dusk approaches, the middle son trailing behind him, both of them thoroughly dirty and entirely pleased with themselves. The boy announces proudly that he helped dig, which probably means he moved approximately one spadeful of dirt, while asking 47 questions about worms and roots and why dirt is brown. Her husband confirms this with a look that manages to communicate both patience and exhaustion. The expression of a man who loves his son but is very much ready to hand him back to his mother. She accepts her son's return with affection, listening to his excited account of the afternoon's adventures while simultaneously beginning preparations for the evening meal. He talks without pausing for breath, explaining everything he saw and did and wondered about, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share. She makes appropriate sounds of interest and amazement, asking questions that encourage him to continue, knowing that his enthusiasm will wind down eventually and he will move on to something else. The evening meal is simpler than midday dinner, as evenings usually are. Bread and cheese again, some of the new eggs boiled in a pot, a handful of nuts that her daughter gathered from under the oak tree at the edge of their plot. They eat as the light fails, the fire providing both illumination and warmth as the temperature drops with nightfall. The conversation flows easily, her husband describing his afternoon's work, the children sharing their various activities. She contributed news from the peddler and observations about the chickens and the state of the vegetable garden. After the meal, there is a brief period of relative calm before sleep claims everyone. Her husband sits near the fire, mending a tool handle with the same focused attention she applies to sewing. The crack in the wood is concerning, but not yet critical, and he wraps it carefully with twine to prevent further splitting. It is a temporary repair that will need more permanent attention eventually, but temporary repairs are sometimes all that time and resources allow. Her daughter plays quietly with the baby, teaching him to stack small wooden blocks that their father made during last winter's long evenings. The blocks are uneven and roughly carved, but they serve their purpose, providing entertainment and helping small hands develop coordination. The baby knocks them over with great satisfaction, delighted by the noise and the scattering, and his sister patiently rebuilds the stack for him to destroy again. The 5-year-old arranges his toys in what appears to be a very important pattern, the logic of which is clear only to him. He mutters to himself as he works, narrating some internal story that involves complex relationships between the wooden animals and mysterious rules that govern their interactions. She watches him with fond amusement, recognizing her own childhood tendency toward elaborate, imaginative play, hoping he will retain some of that creativity even as life channels it toward more practical directions. She uses this time to return to the spinning, her hands moving automatically while her mind wanders. The spindle turns, the thread grows, and she thinks about the coming winter and what preparation still needs completion. The garden must be fully harvested, the last of the apples picked and stored, the house sealed against drafts as well as their materials allow, firewood accumulated in quantities that will seem excessive until February arrives and proves them barely adequate. She thinks about her daughter growing older, already 8 and approaching the age when more serious consideration must be given to her future. In a few more years, marriage will become a real possibility rather than an abstract future event. She will need to find a suitable match, someone from a good family who will treat her well, someone whose household she can enter without being too far from her own family. These arrangements take time and careful negotiation, and she should probably begin making inquiries soon. She thinks about her sons and what opportunities might exist for them. The oldest boy could potentially apprentice to a craftsman if they can afford the fee, and if a suitable position becomes available. The younger boy is still too small to predict, but she hopes he will have choices beyond simply following his father into fieldwork. Not because there is anything wrong with fieldwork, but because having options seems better than having none. She thinks about her own aging parents, her father still working but slowing down noticeably, his back bothering him more each winter, her mother-in-law who lives with her husband's brother and his family, growing forgetful and requiring increasing care. The question of what will happen as the older generation ages, can no longer manage independently, is one that weighs on her mind with increasing frequency. In a world without formal systems of support, family must care for family, and she knows that responsibility will eventually fall to her generation. These thoughts are neither happy nor sad. They are simply the constant background processing of a woman who is responsible for keeping multiple lives organized and moving forward. She makes mental notes and plans and adjustments, storing information away for when it will be needed, maintaining the complex web of relationships and obligations that define her world. The thread grows on the spindle, wrapping in neat layers that will eventually be woven into cloth. Her daughter has set aside her own spinning and taken the baby into her lap, rocking him gently as his eyes grow heavy. The child is a natural caretaker, instinctively understanding what the baby needs, responding to his moods with the patience that many adults lack. She will make a good mother someday, assuming she survives childbirth and the 100 other dangers that await women in this world. The 5-year-old's energy is finally beginning to flag, his movements slowing, his narration becoming quieter. He fights sleep with the determination of children who believe they might miss something important if they surrender to rest. But his body is making decisions his will cannot override. His eyes droop, his head nods, and soon he will give up the fight entirely. The fire crackles and settles, sending up small showers of sparks that die before reaching the ceiling. Her husband has finished with the tool handle and moved on to checking their small supply of iron nails, counting them and sorting them by size, making sure they know what they have before winter arrives and outdoor work becomes difficult. He is a careful man, her husband, thorough in ways that she appreciates even when his thoroughness means tasks take longer than they might otherwise. The room has taken on the quiet quality that precedes sleep, everyone winding down from the day's activities, energy levels dropping as darkness deepens outside. The single window shows nothing but black now, the stars beginning to appear in the clear autumn sky. She can hear a dog barking somewhere in the village, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. In the distant sound of someone closing shutters against the night. The children go to bed in sequence. The baby first, already mostly asleep in his sister's arms, transferred carefully to a sleeping spot where he settles without waking. The middle son next, his eyes finally closing despite his best efforts to remain alert. His small body going limp as sleep claims him completely. Her daughter last, old enough now to help with the nighttime preparations, banking the fire so we'll survive until morning, checking that the door is properly barred against animals and less welcome visitors. The door has a simple wooden bar that slides into brackets, not sophisticated but effective enough for a village where serious crime is rare and most threats come from wandering animals rather than malicious humans. She checks it twice, a habit formed from years of being responsible for her children's safety, knowing that the bar alone would not stop a determined intruder, but taking comfort in the ritual of checking. Nonetheless, her husband has already settled onto their sleeping platform, leaving space for her. Waiting in the patient way of people who have shared a bed for 11 years and know each other's nighttime rhythms. The platform is simply a wooden frame raised slightly off the ground, filled with straw that gets changed when it becomes too compressed or too inhabited by insects, covered with a thin mattress stuffed with more straw and whatever wool they can spare. It is not luxurious by any measure, but it is better than sleeping directly on the floor. And better is what they can manage. She joins him, feeling the familiar give of the mattress beneath her weight, the scratchy warmth of the wool blanket they share. The blanket is heavy and slightly rough, made from their sheep's wool and woven by her own hands over the course of many winter evenings. It has patches where we're required repair, and it smells faintly of lanolin and bodies in the general scent of a well-used household textile. It is probably the most valuable single object they own, aside from their cooking pot and tools. They speak briefly about tomorrow's plans. His work in the fields continuing, with ditch clearing and fence repair. Her intention to finish harvesting the garden and start preserving what can be preserved for winter. The conversation is practical rather than romantic, but there is affection in it nonetheless. The comfortable exchange of people who have built a life together through shared work and mutual dependence. They have survived 11 years of marriage, 3 pregnancies, countless illnesses, several bad harvests, and a general grinding difficulty of medieval peasant life. That survival is its own form of love. He mentions that his back has been bothering him more lately. The kind of admission he makes only when the pain has become impossible to ignore. She makes a mental note to prepare a poultice of herbs that might help, knowing it will provide limited relief, but feeling the need to do something. His body is the engine that powers their household's survival. If he becomes unable to work, everything collapses. This fear lives in the back of her mind, constantly. Never stated, but always present. She tells him about the peddler's news, the dispute over grazing rights that mirrors tensions in their own village. The barn fire that reminds them both how vulnerable their own thatched roof is to accident or lightning. He listens with the attention of someone who understands that information about neighboring communities is relevant to their own situation. They discuss briefly whether they should contribute to rebuilding the burned barn, weighing Christian duty against their own limited resources, eventually concluding that a small contribution of labor would be appropriate when the time comes. The conversation winds down naturally, both of them too tired for extended discussion. He kisses her forehead, the same gesture of affection he offered this morning, bookending the day with familiar tenderness. She settles against him, taking comfort in his warmth and solidity, grateful for his presence, even as she acknowledges the ways marriage limits her life. She has no legal identity separate from his. She cannot own property in her own name. Her labor belongs to him in the eyes of law and custom. And yet, within their actual marriage, she makes decisions constantly, manages resources, exercises authority over their household. The gap between legal theory and practical reality is wide enough for entire lives to exist within it. Sleep begins to claim her. That gradual softening of consciousness that comes after a day of constant physical and mental work. Her body relaxes section by section, muscles unclenching, breathing deepening, thoughts becoming less linear and more dreamlike. She is aware of her children sleeping nearby, the sound of their breathing mixing with her husband's, creating the particular soundscape of family that has become the background of her existence before sleep fully takes her. Her mind drifts through a series of disconnected thoughts and observations. She remembers her mother's hands, rough and capable, moving through the same tasks she performed today. She thinks about how her daughter's hands are beginning to develop the same capable roughness, calluses that mark a working woman. She wonders if her daughter will remember her hands the same way decades from now, when she is managing her own household and trying to pass knowledge to her own daughters. She thinks about the cycles that structure her world, the daily cycle of waking and working and sleeping, the weekly cycle marked by Sunday's church attendance and rest, the yearly cycle of planting and growing and harvesting and preserving, the life cycle of birth and childhood and marriage and childbearing and aging and death. Everything repeats, everything circles back, patterns within patterns extending forever in both directions. She thinks about the women who came before her, generations stretching back through time, all of them doing essentially what she does, managing households and raising children and keeping families alive through competence and endurance. She is one link in an unbroken chain, connected to the past through her mother and grandmother and all the women before them, connected to the future through her daughter and the daughters her daughter might bear. This thought is both comforting and overwhelming, the weight of continuity and the insignificance of any single life. Her last conscious thoughts are practical. Running through tomorrow's tasks one final time. Finish the garden harvest. Check the chicken who has been acting strange. Repair the tear in the 5-year-old's tunic. Prepare something for her husband's back. Spin more wool, because there's always more wool to spin. The list is endless and familiar. The same general categories with minor variations, day after day, year after year. And then sleep takes her completely, pulling her down into darkness and rest, giving her body the recovery time it needs to face tomorrow's identical challenges. She sleeps deeply, the sleep of physical exhaustion, her breathing slow and steady, her face relaxing into the softness that comes when the day's responsibilities can finally be set aside. The house settles into nighttime silence. The fire breathes quietly in its bed of ash. The children sleep in their tumbled pile, the baby occasionally making small noises, the middle son shifting position, the daughter still and peaceful. Outside, the village is dark and quiet, every household following the same pattern. People sleeping because darkness makes work impossible, and sleep is free, and morning will come regardless. The night is cold, but not yet bitterly so. October nights are preparation for the real cold of winter, practice for the months when being warm becomes the primary concern in all. Other considerations become secondary to maintaining fire and shelter. But tonight, the cold is merely uncomfortable rather than dangerous, requiring blankets and closed shutters, but not yet requiring the desperate measures that deep winter demands. Stars wheel slowly overhead, following patterns that have been observed and marked for generations, helping farmers know when to plant and when to harvest, when to expect rain and when to expect frost. She does not see them, deep in sleep, but they are there nonetheless. The same stars that shone on our ancestors and will shine on our descendants, unchanging while human lives flicker briefly and go out. Time passes in the way it does at night, both quickly and slowly. Subjective experience dissolving into the objective fact of ours moving toward dawn. The village sleeps. The animals sleep. The land rests between seasons. The harvest finished. Winter not yet arrived. A brief pause in the endless cycle of agricultural work. In a few hours, roosters will announce the sun's return with their usual confidence and poor timing. Fires will be rebuilt from preserved coals. People will rise and dress and begin again the endless cycle of work that defines their existence. She will wake before dawn, as she always does, okay? And start the same routines that started today and yesterday and all the days before. But for now, there is only rest. The work is paused. The responsibilities are temporarily set aside. Her body recovers, her mind quiets. And she exists in the suspended state that sleep provides, neither past nor future, but simply present, simply breathing, simply being. Her life is ordinary in every way. She is one of thousands of women doing similar work in similar villages across England, across Europe, across the medieval world. Nothing about her is unique or remarkable. She will never do anything that history considers worth recording. No chronicle will mention her name. No document will preserve her story. When she dies, probably in childbirth or from one of the illnesses that sweep regularly through medieval villages, she will be buried in the churchyard and remembered by her children and maybe her grandchildren. And then she will fade completely from human memory. But her ordinariness is precisely what makes her significant. She represents the vast majority of human experience across most of human history. The people who worked and raised children and kept households functioning and lived and died without any record being made. The foundation upon which everything else was built. The constant background hum of human survival that made possible the occasional spectacular events that historians choose to record. Without women like her, there would be no medieval England. No knights, because someone had to raise boys who became knights. No monasteries, because someone had to grow food that fed monks. No cathedrals, because someone had to bear children who became stonemasons. No kings, because someone had to manage the household economies that generated the surplus, that paid taxes, that funded royal courts. Everything spectacular rests on the foundation of ordinary competent work done by ordinary competent people. She would not think of herself this way. Of course, she thinks of herself simply as herself, trying to keep her family fed and healthy, trying to survive another winter, trying to raise her children to adulthood. She does not think in terms of historical significance or social foundations. She thinks in terms of whether there is enough bread and whether the children are warm enough and whether her husband's back will prevent him from working. Her concerns are immediate and concrete and entirely practical. Is there food? Is there fuel? Are the children well? Is the roof solid? These questions are the same questions humans have asked throughout history. The basic requirements of survival that must be met before anything else becomes possible. And she meets them, day after day, with competence and determination and occasional grace. She manages her complex household economy with skills that rival any merchant's accounting. She keeps children alive in a world where half of all children die before adulthood. She maintains relationships that provide crucial support networks. She contributes economically through her labor while simultaneously managing all domestic responsibilities. She makes countless decisions every day, balancing competing priorities, allocating scarce resources, planning for futures both near and distant. This requires intelligence and skill and knowledge and judgment. It requires physical strength and endurance. It requires emotional resilience and the ability to continue functioning through grief and fear and exhaustion. It requires social awareness and the ability to navigate complex community relationships. It requires all of these things, constantly, without recognition or respite. She possesses all of these capabilities. She exercises them daily. And history will not remember any of it, because history records wars and politics and the actions of powerful men, not the daily work of ordinary women that made everything else possible. The injustice of this is It's profound, but also entirely irrelevant to her life. She does not need historical recognition. She needs to keep her children alive and her household functioning. Her validation comes from concrete results: bread successfully baked, cloth successfully woven, children successfully raised to the next year. These are measurable achievements with immediate consequences. Tomorrow, she will wake and continue her work, as she has done and will do, adding another day to the accumulation of days that constitute her life. The work will be hard. The challenges will be constant. The rewards will be small and practical rather than grand and abstract, and she will meet it all with the same steady competence she has always shown, because that is what is required, and she is capable of meeting requirements. The night deepens toward its darkest point, the hours before dawn, when sleep is deepest and the world seems most still. She sleeps on, her body making the repairs that sleep enables, her mind processing the day's experiences into memory and skill. The baby stirs briefly, making small noises, then settles again without waking. The daughter shifts position, pulling the blanket more tightly around herself. The middle son sleeps with the complete abandon of the young and healthy. Her husband's breathing changes slightly, suggesting dreams, some internal narrative playing out in his sleeping mind. She does not wake, too deep in her own rest to notice these small variations. They sleep side by side, partners in the enterprise of survival, their lives intertwined by marriage and children and shared work in the simple fact of facing the same challenges together. Outside, the autumn wind moves through trees that are beginning to lose their leaves. The sound is gentle, a whisper rather than a roar, the wind not yet carrying the bitter edge it will have in January. A fox crosses through the village, silent and purposeful, hunting for mice and voles and whatever else its opportunistic nature can find. The chickens in their coop shift and settle, making small sounds of contentment or discomfort, their simple lives bounded by the rhythm of day and night, and the presence or absence of food. The bread she baked earlier sits cooling on its shelf, transformed through her labor from grain to flour to dough to sustenance. The wool she spun waits to be woven, transformed through her labor from raw fleece to thread to eventually cloth. The children she pours sleep peacefully, transformed through her labor from potential to actual, from dependent infants to growing people who will someday manage their own households. Everything she touches, she transforms. Raw materials become finished goods. Chaos becomes order. Potential becomes actual. This is the work of household management, this constant transformation of resources into survival, of effort into results, of one day into the next. And she does it without fanfare or recognition, simply because it needs doing and she is the one positioned to do it. There is heroism in this, though it is the quiet heroism of persistence rather than the dramatic heroism of singular great deeds. She endures when endurance is required. She adapts when adaptation is necessary. She continues when continuation seems impossible. Day after day, year after year, until her time ends. The medieval world is built on this foundation of quiet heroism. Thousands of women doing difficult work competently, keeping households functioning, keeping children alive, keeping the basic machinery of civilization operating. They are invisible to history, but essential to everything history records. They are the ground beneath everyone's feet, unnoticed until it is removed and everything collapses. She sleeps, unaware of her own significance, focused entirely on the practical requirements of her actual life rather than any abstract historical role. This is appropriate. Theoretical significance does not feed children or keep roofs repaired. Practical competence does. And she has practical competence in abundance, accumulated through years of experience and observation and practice. The hours pass. The night moves toward its conclusion. Dawn approaches, inevitable and unconcerned with human preferences. The roosters will crow. The fire will need rebuilding. The children will need feeding. The work will resume, exactly where it left off yesterday, continuing forward through time. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight, now, in this moment, there is only sleep and rest and the temporary peace that comes from having survived another day successfully. She has fed her family. She has completed necessary tasks. She has maintained her household. She has done what needed doing. And now she rests, earning through her day's work this night's sleep, preparing through this night's sleep for tomorrow's work. The deepest part of night settles over the village like a blanket. That profound darkness that exists only in places without artificial light, where the absence of the sun means complete blackness except for whatever the moon and stars can provide. Tonight the moon is waning, offering only minimal illumination, and clouds have begun to gather, blocking even that small light. The darkness is so complete that if she were to open her eyes, she would see nothing at all, no difference between eyes open and eyes closed. But she does not open her eyes. She sleeps deeply now, her body having surrendered completely to rest, her breathing slow and even, her face relaxed in ways it never is during waking hours when the constant low-level tension of responsibility keeps certain muscles always slightly engaged. In sleep, all of that releases. Her jaw unclenches, her brow smooths, her shoulders drop away from her ears. She looks younger in sleep, the worry lines less pronounced, the tiredness temporarily erased. Her dreams, when they come, are not grand narratives or symbolic journeys. They are simple and domestic replays of familiar tasks with slight variations. She dreams about kneading bread, the dough responding perfectly under her hands, rising to exactly the right height. She dreams about her daughter, older now, competent and confident, managing her own household with the same skills she has been teaching her. The dream fills her with quiet pride, the satisfaction of seeing her knowledge successfully transmitted to the next generation. Sometimes the dream shifts and she is young again, learning from her own mother, watching those capable hands demonstrate how to card wool, how to judge when dough has risen enough, how to tell if a chicken is unwell just by the way it stands. Her mother's voice comes back to her in sleep, patient and encouraging, the same tone she now uses with her own daughter. The continuity pleases some deep part of her mind. This unbroken chain of women teaching women, knowledge flowing forward through time. In her dream, her mother is showing her how to spin thread evenly, the spindle turning in practiced hands, the wool feeding through fingers that know exactly how much twist to add, how much tension to maintain. She watches with the intensity of childhood learning, wanting to understand, wanting to please, wanting to be competent like her mother is competent. The dream has the quality of memory, but also the soft edges of imagination. The past filtered through years of her own experience until she is not entirely sure what she actually remembers and what she has constructed from later. Understanding, the baby makes small sounds in his sleep, not quite waking, but shifting from one level of unconsciousness to another. She stirs slightly at the noise, some part of her mother brain, always listening, even in sleep, ready to wake fully if the sound becomes urgent. But the baby settles again, and so does she, sinking back into the deeper currents of rest without ever fully surfacing to consciousness. This happens perhaps 3 or 4 times each night. These moments of near waking when she checks on children without fully engaging her conscious mind, a skill learned through years of interrupted sleep. Her husband shifts beside her, the wooden platform creaking slightly with the movement, and unconsciously she adjusts her position to accommodate his new arrangement of limbs. They have been sleeping side by side for so many years that these adjustments happen automatically. Their bodies having learned to share space without conscious negotiation. His warmth radiates against her back, and she settles closer to it, seeking heat even in sleep as October nights grow colder. He is a furnace of a man, her husband, always warm even in winter, and she has learned to use him as her personal heating source during cold nights. The house makes its nighttime sounds around them, the settling noises of wood and thatch responding to temperature changes, to wind pressure, to the subtle shifts that happen in any structure as hours pass. There is a particular creak in the roof beam that sounds almost like a voice, and she has learned to distinguish it from actual human sounds, just as she has learned to distinguish between the baby's real cries and the small noises he makes while dreaming. The house has its own language, and after years of living here, she speaks it fluently without conscious effort. The fire has died down to coals now, barely glowing, providing almost no light, but still radiating enough heat to take the worst edge off the cold. By morning, it will need to be rebuilt from these coals, the daily resurrection of fire that marks the beginning of each new day. The coals sit in their bed of ash like small orange eyes, watching the sleeping household, maintaining their quiet vigil through the night. She banked them carefully before bed, covering them with just the right amount of ash to preserve them without smothering them, a judgment that comes from years of experience and occasional failures that taught her the correct balance. Outside, the village is silent, except for the occasional dog bark, some animal disturbed by a fox or a badger passing through, alert for a moment, then settling back to sleep. The silence is different from daytime quiet, heavier somehow, more complete. It is the silence of a world at rest, of human activity paused, of the brief respite that darkness provides from the constant demands of work and survival. During the day, the village hums with activity, the sounds of work and conversation and children and animals creating a constant background noise. At night, all of that stops, and what remains is this profound quiet that would be unsettling if it were not so familiar. Her body uses this time well, doing the invisible work of maintenance and repair that sleep enables. Small tears and muscle fiber heal themselves, the microscopic damage from carrying water and kneading dough and lifting children being patched and reinforced. Her immune system processes the day's exposures, building defenses against the countless pathogens she encountered while handling food and children and chickens, fighting off minor infections before they can establish themselves. Her digestive system continues its slow work, extracting nutrients from the day's meals, the barley and onions and bread and cheese all being broken down and distributed to where they are needed. Her spine decompresses slightly as she lies horizontal, the pressure of upright posture released, giving her back a few millimeters of height that will be lost again when she stands in the morning. Her feet, which bore her weight all day, relax and recover, the small bones settling into their proper positions, the muscles releasing their tension. Her hands, which worked constantly from dawn to dusk, rest open and loose, no longer gripping spindles or knives or babies or buckets. Every part of her body takes advantage of this horizontal rest, this temporary freedom from gravity's constant pull. Her brain, too, is busy despite her unconsciousness. Memories from the day are being processed, sorted, filed away for future reference. The feeling of the spindle in her hand, the weight of the water bucket, the exact shade of brown that means bread is properly baked. All of these sensory experiences are being consolidated into the vast library of knowledge she has accumulated over 31 years of life. Tomorrow, she will wake with this knowledge slightly more embedded, slightly more automatic. The unconscious competence that comes from sufficient practice. The neural pathways associated with her most frequent tasks are being strengthened during sleep, the connections becoming more efficient, making tomorrow's repetition of the same tasks slightly easier than today's. This is how skill builds over time, through the combination of conscious practice during the day and unconscious consolidation during the night. She does not know about neural pathways or consolidation, but she knows from experience that sleep makes her sharper, that things which seemed difficult yesterday become easier today. That practice, combined with rest, leads to improvement. She dreams again, this time of summer, which seems impossibly distant in October, but which will eventually return, bringing its own rhythms and challenges. In the dream, she is in the garden, the sun warm on her back, her hands in the soil, planting seeds that will become vegetables that will feed her family. The dream has the soft, golden quality of idealized memory. All the pleasant parts amplified, the difficult parts gently blurred. The summer in her dream has no drought or insects or back-breaking weeding, just endless warm sunshine and plants that grow obligingly without problems. Her daughter appears in the dream, helping with the planting, and they work together in comfortable silence, the way they sometimes do in waking life. The dream daughter is perhaps a year or two older than the real daughter, showing her what is coming, what the girl will become. She is capable and confident in the dream, handling tasks independently, making good decisions, demonstrating the competence that her mother has been carefully cultivating through years of patient teaching. The 5-year-old mutters something in his sleep, a fragment of whatever dream a 5-year-old has, probably involving the wooden animals his father carved for him in some elaborate scenario he has invented. She smiles slightly in her own sleep, some part of her consciousness registering her son's voice and responding with automatic affection, even without waking. He is at that wonderful age where imagination runs wild and everything is possible, where a wooden cow can talk and have adventures and do things that no actual cow would ever do. She treasures this phase while it lasts, knowing that practicality and responsibility will eventually temper his creativity the way they temper everyone's. Time passes in that strange way it does during sleep, where hours feel compressed and expanded simultaneously, where the normal rules of temporal experience seem suspended. She has no awareness of time passing. She exists in an eternal present of sleep, neither remembering the day before nor anticipating the day ahead, simply being in this moment of rest. This timelessness is one of sleep's gifts, release from the constant awareness of time that structures waking life, where every task must be timed and every moment has its designated purpose. The deepest part of night is also the coldest, that hour before dawn when temperatures drop to their lowest point. The wool blanket that covers her family is heavy and warm, made from 2 years' worth of wool from their sheep washed and carded and spun and woven into cloth, then sewn into a blanket that is now one of their most valuable possessions. The wool still carries a faint scent of lanolin, that particular sheepy smell that never quite washes out completely. She finds it comforting rather than unpleasant, this reminder of the living animal whose fleece keeps them warm. Her face is exposed to the cold air, and unconsciously she burrows deeper into the covers, seeking warmth, preserving heat. Her body knows how to do this without her conscious direction, adjusting and adapting to maintain the temperature necessary for comfortable sleep. The blanket has developed certain worn spots over the years, places where the weave has loosened or torn and been mended, but these imperfections do not diminish its essential function of keeping them warm. She has mended it many times and will mend it many more before it finally wears out completely and must be replaced. Somewhere in the village, a baby cries, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. It is not her baby, and some sleeping part of her brain knows this by the timbre and tone, so she does not wake. But she registers it nonetheless, that sound of infant distress that triggers automatic response in women who have born children. Another mother is waking now, responding to her child's needs, engaging in the same work of caretaking that transcends the boundary between sleep and waking. She feels a moment of sympathy for this other mother, knowing how difficult it is to wake in the deep night. How much effort it takes to rouse yourself when your body is crying out for continued rest. Her daughter, 8 years old and already showing signs of the woman she will become, sleeps peacefully with one arm thrown over the baby, protective, even in unconsciousness. The girl has good instincts for caretaking, gentle hands, and patient temperament, qualities that will serve her well in her own future as a wife and mother. She naturally gravitates toward helping with the younger children, not because she is forced to, but because she seems to genuinely enjoy it, taking pleasure in their laughter and showing remarkable patience with their demands and needs. Watching her daughter develop these qualities has been one of the unexpected joys of motherhood. She expected to teach skills like spinning and cooking and managing a household, and she is doing that, okay? But she did not expect to discover that her daughter has a natural gift for nurturing an instinctive understanding of what small children need, an ability to soothe and comfort that seems to come from some deep internal source rather than from external teaching. This gift will make her daughter's life easier in some ways, though it may also mean she takes on more than her share of family responsibility, the way competent people often do. The night continues its slow progression toward morning, though dawn is still hours away, okay? The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that shone on her grandparents and will shine on her grandchildren, okay? Unchanged and unchanging while human lives flicker briefly beneath them. She does not see them, deep in sleep, but they are there nonetheless, patient and eternal and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The stars have seen countless generations of humans living and dying, working and resting, struggling and surviving. They will see countless more. If she were awake and looking at the stars, she might know some of their patterns, the basic navigation knowledge that even peasants possess, the tending of which constellations mark which seasons, which stars indicate north, which patterns signal the approach of winter or the return of spring. But she is not awake, and the stars are simply there, doing what stars do, burning in the darkness, marking time on a scale that makes human lifespans seem like brief sparks. Her mind drifts through fragments of thought that are not quite dreams and not quite waking consciousness. She thinks, in some wordless way, about bread and children in the coming winter. She thinks about her mother, dead these 19 years, and whether she would be pleased with how her daughter has managed. She thinks about her own hands, rougher now than they were at 15, marked by years of work, capable and strong. She thinks about the brown hen who's been acting strange, and whether this means illness or simply a mood, the way chickens sometimes have moods. These thoughts have no real form or structure. They are more like feelings than ideas, more like impressions than coherent narratives. They rise and fall in our sleeping mind like waves, coming and going without conscious direction or control. This is the mind at rest, processing without analyzing, experiencing without judging, simply being without the constant demands that waking consciousness makes. It is a kind of freedom, this release from the need to think productively, to plan ahead, to solve problems. In sleep, her mind can simply wander where it wants, following its own mysterious logic. Her husband's breathing changes slightly, suggesting he has moved from one stage of sleep to another, perhaps from deep sleep to the lighter stage where dreams are more vivid and movement more likely. She adjusts unconsciously to his movement, their bodies in constant, subtle negotiation about space, in warmth and comfort, a dance they have been doing for 11 years without ever discussing it or thinking about it consciously. They have learned each other's sleeping patterns and preferences through pure exposure, thousands of nights side by side, teaching them how to share space harmoniously. He sometimes talks in his sleep, muttering fragments of sentences that make sense to whatever dream he is having, but which sound like nonsense to anyone listening. She has learned to ignore these nocturnal monologues, just as he has learned to ignore her occasional sleep sounds. They each have their quirks and habits, and long marriage means accepting these rather than fighting them. He snores sometimes, especially when he has been working particularly hard and is deeply exhausted. She has learned to find the snoring almost soothing, a sign that he is deeply asleep and therefore resting well, recovering from his day's labor. The baby sighs in his sleep, a sound of complete contentment. She responds with her own small sigh. The two of them connected, even in unconsciousness, by the bond between mother and child. This bond is so fundamental to her existence that it operates beneath thought, beneath awareness, simply part of the fabric of who she is. She is someone's daughter, even though that someone is dead. She is someone's wife. She is someone's mother 3 times over. These relationships define her in ways both legal and personal, constraining and enabling, limiting and expanding. The bond with each child is different. She has discovered her daughter she loves with a mixture of pride and projection, seeing herself reflected and hoping to see the girl avoid her own mistakes. Her middle son she loves with amused affection, delighted by his energy and curiosity, even when they are exhausting. The baby she loves with fierce protectiveness, the vulnerability of infancy triggering deep instincts to guard and shelter. All 3 loves are real and profound, but they have different textures, different qualities, like 3 varieties of the same essential emotion. The fire's coals shift slightly, settling deeper into their bed of ash, the faint glow dimming even further. By morning, the fire will be barely alive, just enough heat preserved to enable rebuilding without starting completely from scratch. This preservation of fire overnight is a skill taught to children as soon as they are old enough to understand, because fire is life in medieval households, the source of warmth and light, and the means to cook food and boil water. Losing fire completely means the difficult work of creating it anew from flint and steel, a task that takes time and effort and patience, and occasionally bloodied knuckles when the steel slips and catches skin. She has made fire from scratch perhaps a dozen times in her life, usually when traveling or when something went wrong with the overnight banking. She is competent at it, but not particularly fast, and she much prefers the easier method of maintaining fire, continuously banking it at night and rebuilding it in the morning, keeping it alive through careful attention rather than having to resurrect it from nothing. Fire is both servant and master, requiring constant care and attention. Capable of warming a house or burning it down, depending on how carefully it is managed. She sleeps on, unaware of the fire state, unaware of the passage of time, unaware of anything except the deep rest her body is taking. This rest is essential, the foundation upon which tomorrow's work will be built. Without adequate sleep, she would be slower, clumsier, more prone to mistakes and accidents. Her judgment would suffer, her decision-making would decline, her patience would fray, making her snappish with the children, irritable with her husband. Her physical coordination would worsen, making her more likely to cut herself with a knife or burn herself on the pot. Sleep is not luxury or indulgence, but biological necessity, as essential as food or water. She knows this from experience, from the times when children were sick and sleep was broken. 4 days at a stretch, when she functioned on minimal rest and felt herself becoming someone she did not recognize, short-tempered and weepy and unable to think clearly. She knows the value of sleep, the way she knows the value of bread, through the direct experience of what happens when you do not have enough. The night holds her gently, this darkness that asks nothing and gives everything, this silence that demands no response and requires no effort. In sleep, she is released from all her roles and responsibilities, free to simply exist without doing, without managing, without the constant vigilance that daytime requires. This freedom is temporary but precious, these hours of rest that make possible the hours of work that will follow. She does not consciously appreciate this freedom because she is unconscious, but her body and mind appreciate it nonetheless, taking full advantage of the opportunity to rest and recover. Around her, the village sleeps in similar fashion. Every household following the same pattern, every family gathered in their own small spaces, seeking warmth and safety and rest. They are all connected by these shared rhythms, by the common experience of being human in the 14th century, by the challenges they all face and the solutions they have all developed through generations of accumulated wisdom. The blacksmith sleeps near his forge, dreaming perhaps of metal and fire and the satisfaction of shaping iron to useful forms. The miller sleeps near his mill. His sleep, perhaps, less peaceful, because mills are expensive and temperamental, and always threatening to break in expensive ways. The widow, who lives alone at the edge of the village, sleeps lightly, alert, even in rest, because solitary women must always maintain a degree of vigilance that married women can sometimes relax. She has a dog who sleeps near her door, adding another layer of security, warning of any approach. The village respects her independence, but also worries about her vulnerability. The neighbors check on her regularly, making sure she has what she needs, including firewood and food and the reassurance of community connection. Tomorrow, they will all wake and work and interact and maintain the complex web of relationships that makes village life possible. The smith will repair tools. The miller will grind grain. She will bake bread and spin wool and care for children. Her husband will work in the fields. Everyone will perform their designated roles, contributing to the collective survival that is only possible through cooperation and specialization. Tonight, they simply sleep, united in this basic human need, this surrender to exhaustion. This trust that morning will come and bring with it another chance to survive and continue. Her sleep is deep now, so deep that nothing short of urgent crisis would wake her. Her brain has descended into the stages where restoration happens most effectively, where the day's damage is repaired and tomorrow's resilience is built. Her body temperature has dropped slightly to its nighttime level. Her breathing is at its slowest and most regular. She is as close to completely at rest as a living body can be, while still maintaining the basic functions necessary for life. Her heart beats steadily, requiring no conscious attention. Her lungs expand and contract rhythmically. Her digestive system continues its slow work. All of these automatic functions proceed without her awareness or direction, the miraculous self-regulating systems that keep her alive without requiring constant conscious management. She does not have to remember to breathe or tell her heart to beat. These things simply happen, have been happening since her birth, will continue happening until her death. The reliability of these automatic systems is something she takes completely for granted, as everyone does until they fail. The hours pass, uncounted and unmarked. In her deep sleep, time has no meaning. There is only the eternal now of unconsciousness, the suspended state where past and future collapse into present, where nothing exists except the simple fact of being alive and breathing and resting. This timelessness is both the blessing and the curse of sleep. It's blessing because it provides escape from time's constant pressure. It's curse because it means tomorrow arrives whether you are ready or not, time continuing its inexorable march forward, regardless of human preferences. She stirs slightly, some dream or physical sensation causing her to shift position, and settles again without waking. Her body makes these small adjustments throughout the night, preventing any one position from being maintained too long, avoiding the stiffness and discomfort that comes from absolute stillness. She turns from her left side to her right. She shifts her legs. She adjusts her arms, all without ever fully waking, her sleeping brain coordinating these movements automatically. In the morning, she will have no memory of any of these adjustments. Will feel as though she slept without moving, when in fact, she made dozens of small movements throughout the night. The baby makes a small sound again, and again she responds automatically, her hand moving to touch him reassuringly, even though her conscious mind remains asleep. This automatic caregiving, this mother response that operates beneath awareness, is one of the costs and gifts of motherhood. She is never completely off duty, never fully released from responsibility, even in sleep. But this constant low-level awareness also means she can rest while still keeping children safe, can sleep while still fulfilling her primary obligation to protect her offspring. It is exhausting, but also efficient, this ability to rest and remain alert simultaneously. Mothers throughout the village are doing the same thing, sleeping but listening, resting but ready to wake if needed. This is how human children survive their vulnerable early years, through the constant vigilance of mothers who never fully stop paying attention, even in sleep. Fathers sleep more deeply, their biological programming different, their relationship to children mediated through mothers rather than direct. Her husband could sleep through the baby crying, and sometimes does. His brain not wired to respond to infant sounds the way hers is. She does not resent this because it seems simply to be the natural order of things, the way males and females divide the labor of raising young. The night deepens toward its end, though the transition is not yet visible. The darkness remains complete, the silence unbroken, except for natural sounds of wind and settling structures and sleeping animals. She sleeps through all of it, her rest deep and restorative, her body and mind taking the time they need to prepare for tomorrow. In her sleep, she is peaceful, her face soft and unlined, the worry and tiredness temporarily erased. She looks almost like a girl again. The woman and mother and household manager stripped away, leaving just the essential human being underneath all those roles. This is who she is in sleep. Neither wife, nor mother, nor worker, simply herself, simply a human being resting. All the roles and responsibilities that define her waking life fall away in unconsciousness, leaving just the core person, the individual beneath all the social identities and obligations. This stripped-down version of herself exists only in deep sleep, only in these hours of complete rest when no one is watching and nothing is required, and she can simply be without having to perform any particular function or fill any particular role. In a few hours, roosters will begin their announcements. Those optimistic birds who believe themselves responsible for calling the sun back into existence. The darkness will begin to lighten, gray creeping in at the edges, resolving slowly into dawn. People will wake and stretch and begin the process of starting another day. Fires will be rebuilt. Children will be fed. Work will resume its endless cycle. She will wake before dawn, as she always does, and start the same routines that started today and yesterday and all the days before. But that is still to come. For now, in this deep hour of night, there is only sleep and silence and rest. She floats in this peaceful state, her work paused, her responsibilities temporarily set aside, her constant vigilance finally allowed to ease. The peace of this moment is not the peace of a life without struggle, because her life is full of struggle. It is not the peace of certainty about tomorrow, because tomorrow is always uncertain, always bringing challenges that cannot be fully predicted or prepared for. It is simply the peace of present moment rest, of a day completed, of work done adequately, of survival continuing for another rotation of the sun. She sleeps deeply, peacefully, her day's work complete, her body's rest deserved and necessary, received around her, her children sleep safely. Beside her, her husband sleeps soundly. The house stands solid and protective. The night is kind, and all is well in this moment, in this darkness, in this small house, in this small village where an ordinary woman rests from. Another day of ordinary work that made everything else possible. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight, now, in this moment, there is only sleep and rest and the temporary peace that comes from having survived another day successfully. She has fed her family. She has completed necessary tasks. She has maintained her household. She has done what needed doing. And now she rests, earning through her day's work, is preparing through this night's sleep for tomorrow's work.